This wonderful invitation. I'm very honored to be here. It's really a unique opportunity to address a group of economists who are actually concerned about the real economy and how it behaves. What a unique idea. I studied at Purdue back in the 1970s when it was very neoclassical and mathematical program. I became very disenchanted with economics as was practiced back in those days. Well, how most economists practiced economics back in those days. When I was doing my first dissertation, which investigated the labor market as a labor market search from both sides, where you had search on both sides of the economy. It was my observation back then that economics was not empirical. And often back in the 60s and the 70s, it was anti-empirical. So what I did instead for my dissertation was a 500-page thesis on philosophy of science and the methodology of economics. The last several decades, however, we've seen an explosion of empirical work in economics, which I think, of course, is I'm prejudiced, but I think that's a great renaissance. Mostly this is due to lower costs of computation. And I think some of this empirical work is genuine. I think we are actually now doing some genuine empirical testing, at least investigation of economics. Testing, I'll talk more about that for the rest of this discussion. I'm prejudiced also. I think meta-regression analysis is really the way to try to get the most out of empirical work in economics. There's a whole lot of variation about what gets reported on any given topic, and often it's very much at odds with each other. There's a lot of conflict. There's a lot of contradiction in the empirical results that we see. I think meta-analysis and meta-regression analysis is a way to synthesize and make sense out of this morass. Today I would like to talk about testing of economic theories. I want to illustrate this talk with really two pairs of linked meta-analysis. The first of each of these pair of meta-analyses will provide kind of negative, kind of contradictory evidence of some core economic theory. The second of each pair explains the results that we got in the first pair of these meta-analyses. Each of these pair of meta-analyses are kind of logically linked, and I'll talk more about how they're logically linked. I realize that my talk today is, treading on top of some very deep philosophical waters. Mostly I hope to simply spark some discussion. At least that's what I'm looking forward to. First of all, let me just pose a question. If two linked meta-analyses of mature areas of research cannot falsify an economic theory, then what can? Not all of you came to my talk yesterday, so let me give you a couple definitions of meta-analysis and meta-regression analysis. Gene Glass is a psychologist, and he's credited for the modern, revival creation of meta-analysis back in the 1970s. And it refers to a statistical analysis of a large collection of individual studies for the purpose of integrating the findings. It connotes a rigorous alternative to the casual narrative discussions of research studies, which typify our attempts to make sense of the rapidly expanding research literature. As I said yesterday, we now have research overload. It's just really, I think, humanly impossible to synthesize all the empirical work on many topics, not all topics. Some topics there's only a few results, but there's a whole lot of empirical research out there these days. In the 1980s, Steve Gerald and I came up with this idea of meta-regression analysis. And we always saw that as a little different from meta-analysis as it was practiced in psychology and medicine before economists got a hold of it. Because most of our empirical work deals with regression somehow or another, or some transformation of regression coefficients. We always thought if you're going to understand and explain those results, you had to do a meta-regression or a regression analysis of those regression results, and hence meta-regression. And we coined the term back in 1989, and the field has blossomed. I don't have slides about how it's blossomed, but there's some speculation now that there's up to 1,000 meta-regression models have been conducted. Meta-regression studies, I should say, have been conducted now. And maybe as many as 200 per year. You know, a shameless plug for a book. And there's a 20% discount flyer here for anyone who wants to. We have this recently published, Chris Dukuliagas and I from Melbourne. He's a frequent collaborator of mine, a great guy. Just in July, this book came out. It's meant to be an introduction for the novice, but we also try to sort of summarize what the state of the art is right now. And we do have a international organization, MayorNet it's called, that has annual conferences, and this is our way to summarize what conventional wisdom among our group is anyhow. I also try to push the envelope a little bit, develop some new theories, some new ideas in there. Probably trying to do too much, but it's a very slim book. You can probably read it overnight. Well, is economic theory testable? Actually, that was a question I had in my dissertation, by the way. But there's a lot of difficulties here. There's a lot of hurdles that one have to cross in order to make economic theory genuinely testable. I think there's a whole lot of ideological biases out there in the field. This is my opinion. You don't have to agree. I mean, most notably, not so much among this group, of course, but there's a whole lot of free market ideology. Free market's always the best result. I wasn't taught that in graduate school. I was taught there's a lot of exceptions to when the free market would give you the most efficient allocation of resources. But anyway, I think a lot of economists come in with preconceived notions about what the right way to look at empirical results might be. And if it's not ideology, we all have our own commitments to our theory. We're post-Keynesian or neoclassical or neo-Keynesian. Particularly if you spend a career working on a certain set of theories, by God, we're going to find evidence to support those theories. We're not going to find contradictory evidence. We have a paper that's coming out, Chris and I again, that shows the stronger that a consensus is about theory, the less debate there is about, like the law of demand, for example, the greater the bias that you'll find out there. And we have a particular way of defining bias and measuring bias. And we've looked at 87 different areas of research over 3,600 papers, and it's a very strong signal there. Of course, this group, should embrace this. The heterodox, the more diverse opinions, the less bias you have. That's all we're really saying. But we can see this in the research record. What I spent a lot of time talking about in writing papers about for the last 5 years is this idea of publication selection bias. And it's a form of selection bias. Publication selection bias is probably a misnomer. It's just reporting bias. That there's a tendency to report statistically significant results or results as consistent with whatever your view might be. And all empirical economists know that any result or all the empirical results, econometric results that we give are vulnerable to all kinds of misspecification biases. Omitted variable bias, lack of good measurement, improper correction for endogeneity, simultaneity. One could go on, for a half hour about all the different problems. Of course, I think meta-regression analysis is the answer to all these things. Well, if you don't believe me, then you're right. In fact, I encourage you not to believe me. about this idea that meta-regression analysis is the answer. So what's the alternative? Well, I think the alternative is believing is seeing. I love this quote. This quote comes from Densetz in his discussion way back in the 70s about different views of monopoly. He argued there were two views of monopoly, and that researchers tended to interpret their results depending upon the view of monopoly they started with. In psychology, this same sort of notion is called confirmation or experimenter bias. And there's simply a tendency based upon our a priori expectations to view either new information or even the old data that's out there, from the spectacles, from the point of view of our preconceived notions. This shows up when various kinds of questions are asked to mostly undergraduates, but any kind of audience. And what I want to say, a canonical example of this is as follows. When subjects are asked, are you happy with your social life? 73% typically say yes, 22% say no. When asked, are you unhappy with your social life? 65% say yes, 27% say no. It seems that people, react to whatever working hypothesis or crazy idea or push poll. I mean, I get called 2 or 3 times every night now because I'm a voter, and someone's giving me a poll every night. They're not giving me a poll or a survey at all. They're pushing ideas out and want me to vote a certain way. But, anyway, I think it's unfortunately, I think it's true. I think it's the way our psychology is developed. Whatever idea we happen to have running around in our head, we tend to see things through that perspective. This really isn't my field, although I've dabbled in behavioral economics. I mean, the psychologists know about this, cognitive psychologists know about this a lot better than I do. In any case, I think in economics, our ruling paradigm, our ideology, serves as the basis of, not as our social life, but, in an analogy as the social life does here. Whatever ideas out there, we tend to interpret things from that perspective. But you call it theory, and we do need to have theory to interpret empirics, by the way. Another way of looking at this believing is seeing idea is what publication bias is. And that's what I'll spend much of my talk today about. Not entirely, but much of it about. And there's various forms of publication selection bias or reporting selection, another way of looking at it. This comes from Card and Kruger, by the way, from their 1995 AER article. Reviewers and editors are presupposed to interpret papers and to accept papers and expect results that are consistent with whatever the dominant or conventional view might be. Well, we're all smart, young researchers, old researchers. We know what the journals want. And even in our working papers and our theses, we're already going to put those filters there. Not all cases, but in many cases, we're already going to report what the expected results are. And everybody is presupposed to have a preference for statistically significant results. I don't think I have to preach on this, but raise your hand if you need to be convinced. But as I said yesterday, I too have a prejudice for statistically significant results. If they're insignificant, it's just a big question mark. They're really ambiguous. They're not really very informative. But the problem is, I don't think there's anything unethical about this. I don't really have, in some sense, a problem with this. But I think these points of view are going to cause the research that gets reported to be highly selective, and highly selective, it's going to be selection bias. It's just another form of selection bias. And so what many of us do in the meta-regression community is we simply want to filter those biases out. We want to reduce those biases. We want to see clearly through both misspecification biases, but also some of these selection biases. One device that's really simple, too simple I admit, and we do have statistical models that make this more complex, but it's surprisingly how well a simple scatter diagram of research works to identify some of these patterns. and a device called a funnel graph I'm very fond of. It's a simple scatter diagram on the horizontal, try to have the buttons on that. On the horizontal axis, you put the magnitude of the empirical effect. And on the vertical axis, you put precision of that, excuse me, sorry. I have big thumbs, and I'm not very good at texting, so I usually hit two buttons at the same time. But on the vertical axis, you put precision, which is 1 over the standard error of the same thing you have on your horizontal axis. And so the higher the precision, the more accurate your estimate is, and of course, the more concentrated around the true effect you should expect things to be. In the absence of selection, we expect the estimates to be randomly and symmetrically distributed around whatever the genuine true effect might be. And of course, we also, by definition, expect heteroscedasticity, because we have a measure of precision on the vertical axis, which in effect is, it's the inverse of the standard error. Of course, the square of that's the variance, so that's the definition of heteroscedasticity. And we expect this inverted funnel shape simply because at the bottom you have high standard errors, and so you expect, the estimates to have, wide confidence intervals and be all over the place. And anyway, this is the quintessential characteristic way that a funnel graph is supposed to look like if you don't have publication selection bias. We have a nice primer to this, to looking at funnel graphs, that was in Journal of Economic Surveys a couple years ago. This is the same graph. You didn't see the previous graph very well. This comes from Krista Kukliagas and Patrice LaRoche. It's the correlation coefficients between unionism and worker productivity. And they would actually argue there's a lot of publication selection bias here too. It's just that there's two camps. And there's a strong camp that believes that unionism actually increases productivity because people have more loyalty, they take more responsibility of the firm, and of course there's the conflict kind of view as the opposite camp. But at least this graph is more or less symmetric. And I don't want to say it's rare in economics, but of the 87 areas of research that we looked at, about 30% looks something like this, and 70% looks quite a bit different. Here's the value of statistical life, and these all come from hedonic wage estimates. This data originally came from Belovitz et al., and we borrowed their data, and then we corrected their data basically for publication bias. But what you can see here is there's not very many negative values that are reported. It seems that economists are hesitant to report that the value of a human life might be negative. I think even neoclassical economists think human beings have a positive life, but I'm not positive about that. If you actually look at the data more closely, there are a few negative values of a statistical life that's actually out there reported in these papers. But even the meta-analysts themselves are afraid to report it. I mean, sure. I mean, we all agree that human life has a positive value. I mean, I don't debate that. And you even have a paradox of some kind here that I talked about yesterday. That it may well be individually rational for a researcher to not to report a positive value if he or she gets one. I mean, they may well have had poor data, omitted some variables in their particular data set that they knew was important, or just had very noisy data, wrong kind of model. We go on and on and on for that. Occasionally those are going to be very bad estimates, no doubt about it. And by truncating those positive values, you may well report a better value individually. But if the whole field is doing that, then the overall aggregate view we have, our overall aggregate, empirical knowledge that we have in this field is going to be highly distorted. And that's what we're concerned about. That's what we want to correct. I'm going to turn to minimum wage here in a minute. But I mean, it's pretty clear that, you know, neoclassical economic theory believes in a strong law of demand, particularly when it comes to labor. And because of this, there's a, you know, it's in all the introductory textbooks that if you raise the minimum wage, you're going to, I was thinking of unemployment also. I thought I miswrote this, but yeah, if you raise minimum wage, it's going to increase the unemployment, and it's going to reduce employment. I mean, this is just basic economics 101 that you see in all the books. And, you know, it's just part of also the free market neoclassical view that whenever government interferes in the marketplace, only bad things can happen. I mean, everybody knows that, right? Well, Chris Dekuliakis and I expanded on Card and Kruger's original meta-analysis, which had 19 observations, and we carefully read out the whole literature that we could find. We actually found 1,600 and some, but we found 1,474 elasticities, minimum wage elasticities. That is, the effect of raising minimum wage 1%, what effect does that have on reducing employment by whatever percent? These are all for the United States. We did that on purpose because we knew this was controversial. You know, myth and measurement in the 1990s created quite a stir, so we knew we were going to get some pushback. So just so we wouldn't get the criticism that, you know, Europe or whoever else we looked at was very different, you can't compare those two different things, we just focused on the United States because there's so darn many estimates as well. And this is the kind of funnel graph we get. Do you think that's symmetric? If you look at it closely, and it's hard to see, there's about 3 to 1, the number of negative to positive. And that's okay, by the way. I mean, maybe there is an actual negative effect. One thing I should point out that these funnel graphs do not have to have their peak at 0. Their peak should be whatever the true value is. And if there's a strong negative effect, then the peak should be over there and way over the negative side someplace. Too often we find it's close to 0, but oh, thank you. In any case, there's about a 3 to 1 difference there. And another interesting thing is, excuse me, a lot of the negative ones actually appeared, I misspoke, a lot of the positive ones appeared after myth and measurement. After Card and Kruger said it was okay to have no effect and even a positive effect, researchers were a little bit more brave about actually reporting a positive elasticity. This is the efficiency wage hypothesis, and the peak of this one is actually not at 0. That's really right around 0.3. And it's also an elasticity. It's if you raise wages, how much worker productivity. We heard about efficiency wage a minute ago. We did a meta-analysis. I coded this data myself. I coded the data. I hardly ever do that. It's a lot of work. In any case, we have a very simple model in order to test for publication bias and also to correct for it. And it's simply a regression between the effect, the size of the effect, and standard error. This is called an Egger regression. Egger is Egger et al. They're medical researchers. And you can get this from some sophisticated mathematics as a linear approximation. And nonlinear approximations are better models, and we have a paper on that too. But this simple model actually works for a number of good reasons. It gives you a pretty good test, not a powerful one, of whether or not there's publication selection. And that test is a test on beta 0, is what that test is. I call it the FAT test for funnel asymmetry test. It's really an interpretation of whether that's publication bias. It could be for other reasons. And sometimes we have other reasons why we have an asymmetric distribution. But that, I'll go into that afterward or something. The test I invented was this precision effect test, and it's a test on the beta coefficient here. And it's a test for whether or not there's actually a genuine empirical effect, non-zero empirical effect, beyond this selection. That's not all just selection that's causing it. Of course, a couple papers. I don't think I should say too much about the technical stuff here, but we never run the first regression that way. You have to do weighted least squares of some kind, because we know we have heteroscedasticity. When we take a look at those 4 data sets and look for how much publication bias we have, Most of them show publication bias. In the parentheses is the robust t-value, so if they're bigger than about 2, they're significant. Certainly, value statistical life, no surprise, that was highly skewed. Minimum wage, it's clear that there's selection. Well, it's just clear it's not symmetric. I would say efficiency wage is also has publication bias. That's only significant for a one-tailed test, but that's the direction we would expect it to be. So I don't really think that's funning around with it. I would interpret this as accept that there's no bias, simply because yeah, the bias could have gone either way. But you might think there's a little bit of bias in a positive direction here, but in some sense I don't really care. To me, it's not really important whether there's publication selection bias or not. That's not the issue. The issue is what the genuine effect is underneath that. And that's what the PET test is all about. And in minimum wage, notice, once you correct for publication selection, there's no adverse employment effect left. And that's a very robust result, which I'm going to get to. That's not just this simple little test. That's a very robust result. And of course, there is a value of statistical life. This coefficient 0.81 is $810,000. It's an underestimate. 9.5 is the average of just all these estimates. Top 10 and piece are other corrections for publication bias that we've designed. The piece is a better one. It's a nonlinear one. But I mean, those are big revisions from 9.5 to 1.67. That's like a 6-fold reduction in the size of this important parameter. And minimum wage, same kind of thing. You get a big reduction. We argue in our paper that once you make these adjustments, there's no practically significant adverse employment effect. And we never stop at simple models. We always use multiple regression, and we have many explanatory variables, because there's always heterogeneity. This allows for all kinds of heterogeneity, and these interaction terms, these interaction terms here allow for differential publication bias. Publication bias might, be at only the best journals. Only neoclassical economists. Whatever sources you think have more or less publication bias, you can code for those too, and see how it works. Just as an example of what we do here, we coded for 22 different moderator variables that might, thank you, that might affect things. And because I have to hurry on, we find 14 of them statistically significant. We allowed all 22 factors to affect differential publication bias, and also to affect the actual heterogeneity. And there's some important results here. There's a time trend panel's important. We really look just for the overall important robust results. And because I have to hurry up, I'm going to fly through these things. I apologize. But as I already said, and we look at this in a very robust way. We do all kinds of corrections for within sample dependence, robust regressions, different sets of data, and no matter how we look at this, no matter how you think of what best research might be, we get that there's no practically significant adverse effect, and I'll leave it at that. Does this falsify the theory of firm? No. Neoclassical economics is much slipperier than that. And what would it take to actually falsify an economic theory? Well, you need also to have a comprehensive and rigorous objective assessment of a mature area of research, which I think a meta-analysis does. In addition to that, you have to have a second meta-analysis that actually confirms or collaborates what Karl Popper calls a falsifying hypothesis. And Popper said, we shall take it as falsified only if only if we discover a reproducible effect which refutes the theory. In other words, we only accept falsification if a low-level empirical hypothesis which describes such an effect is proposed and corroborated. This kind of hypothesis is called a falsifying hypothesis. Popper doesn't believe in a single experiment or observation can falsify a theory. He really thinks another theory is needed to falsify a theory. And you have to corroborate, keep speaking, that other theory, because I'm in a hurry. Well, in a nutshell, you can look at the efficient efficient wage hypothesis as an explanation of the poor results that we got from minimum wage. And we've already talked about that a little bit. And when you look at that, you get confirmation for the efficiency wage hypothesis. There's a strong effect there. And when you do the multiple regression stuff, multiple MRA, you get confirmation of that. These are very interesting results. You get a high explanation of research results. I still don't think that even these two linked theories will constitute a falsification of the neoclassical theory of the firm. I mean, they interpret things pretty much as tautologies in the first place, and you can embed anything into their model. But when you do embed this idea that wages can affect productivity into their model, it turns out that wage share, that is, the total amount of wages in the economy, that's what this elasticity should be, and that's around 0.6 or 2/3 or something like that. And we find a value that's about half of that. And really fast, and I won't be able to really make this argument very well, I apologize, but I think we have, in fact, come up with a falsification of the natural rate hypothesis. And there's two linked meta-analysis that I conducted during my last sabbatical at Cambridge. And one of those is to try to compile all the tests of the natural rate hypothesis together. And the other one looked at its falsifying hypothesis, that is the idea of unemployment hysteresis, the idea that there's a unit root or just complete inertia in the unemployment series. So there's no natural rate, there's no natural attractor. And I did two separate meta-analysis on those, and there was really strong evidence. What I really liked about the natural rate hypothesis, the more evidence you have, the stronger the rejection was of the natural rate hypothesis. I think that's more important than the average effect. And some ancillary effects, too, seem to support the idea that studies which found evidence against the natural rate hypothesis were stronger than the ones that found support for. And likewise with the unemployment hysteresis, we found evidence that the coefficient on the lag term for the unemployment rate, this is stuff that's been reported. There's 98 estimates that were out there that's already out in the literature. That's what you do with meta-analysis. Anyway, if you look at those over the sample size or degrees of freedom, you see that this converges to 1. And you also see the rate of convergence, which is different whether the series is stationary or non-stationary. You see a rate of convergence that's consistent with non-stationarity and unemployment hysteresis. And so I think these two things together actually give us a falsification of the natural rate hypothesis. Sorry, I did that in whatever, a minute. Do I have a minute or 1 minute? Sure, fine. Just to summarize and leave it where I was before, if two linked meta-analysis of mature areas of research cannot falsify an economic theory, then what can? No, I'll just stop there. Thank you very much.